It's hard to think back just 5 years ago and realize that the definitive worst Spider-Man film was released as recently as that. It's even harder to realize that the famous webhead was at one point the laughingstock of superhero films, all because of one studio who misused the icon for obvious financial reasons. To give you some context, ever since Peter Parker swung onto the scene back in '63, he's been an instant smashing success. For several reasons too. The biggest being that the introduction of this superhero into the comic book industry ushered in a new concept. The idea that a superhero story doesn't have to be an escapist fantasy to be entertaining or good. That, just maybe, sometimes it's good to tackle your insecurities and issues head on, and that the ability to relate to fiction may be just as important as the ability to relate to other people. These are the core concepts that set the foundations for Spider-Man's success, and while the Ditko era of the comics may be cheesy by today's standards, you can really get a feel for why so many teenagers and families worldwide identified with Parker's struggles. That's why, when Sam Raimi was tasked with the job to introduce the mainstream market to Spider-Man, he made absolute sure that the first impressions were the best ones. Jam-packed with as much charm and humor as emotional, hard-hitting moments that resonate with the viewers even to this day. It truly is a marvel, no pun intended, that almost 20 years after Spider-Man in 2002, this trilogy is still regarded as one of the greatest and most important superhero trilogies of all time. Holy shit. Are the 2000s almost 20 years old already? God damn. A lot of people seem to forget this, but Spider-Man, for the longest time, was the poster child of Marvel. Yes, even before the Raimi lineup of films came under the mainstream viewing glass. He was an S-tier hero that required a firm understanding before being tampered with. A hero whose reputation far exceeded him. He was the Amazing Spider-Man. Of course, until one fateful film came out in 2007. That is Spider-Man 3. Uh-oh! This film isn't awful. It isn't even that bad, honestly, but it performed below average, especially considering where Spider-Man 2 left off, which is still argued to be the best Spidey film to date even 15 years after its release. Of course, it's been debated and identified since then on why Spider-Man 3 ended up the way it did, but quite honestly, regardless of how much you argued with the ethics behind the filmmaking process and all the studio tampering, that didn't change the fact that Spider-Man 3 just didn't reach its true potential, and thus not only received bad reputation for the character himself, but overall just performed below average at the box office. This, sadly, was the beginning for the end of Spider-Man, although it wouldn't be until another 5 years before he officially died. Fast forward, 2012. Mark Webb and Sony release a brand spanking new Spidey film only 5 years after the last one. That's right, everybody. Amazing Spider-Man. Our favorite web slinger was back, baby! Except he wasn't at all. Mark Webb is the man who killed Spider-Man for a collective of 4 years straight. And while that doesn't sound like a lot of time, that meant 9 years total would go by before we see another great property in the theaters consisting of Spider-Man. On top of that, these films came out while the Avengers movies were just getting started. Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, Hulk, these were the new hot characters on everyone's minds because these films were being handed off to directors who had passion and respect for these characters. Mark Webb, on the other hand, was a director whose experiences with directing involved romantic comedies, which meant that the love story aspect of these films would truly shine, and they do, but since Spider-Man also revolved around sacrifice, responsibility, tribulations on whether or not the suit helps anyone at all, and much more complex themes that torture Peter Parker as a human being, Mark pretty much relied on the previous trilogy as a blueprint while miscasting almost everybody. I still remember it vividly. It was a hard time to be a Spider-Man fan. Knowing that one of the greatest characters who ever graced the medium would fall off to the wayside in the way that he did, it truly damaged our hearts. So, when Homecoming came out back in 2017, there was a lot of expectations the film had. The biggest one I had going into it was I just wanted it to be a good Spider-Man film. Because by that point, it had been 13 years since the last great flick. I initially enjoyed it in theaters, but I did have some complaints about it myself. Most notably, that it's the riskiest Spidey film that has the most changes. These changes aren't bad because they're changes, but rather how these changes affect certain story elements. Some are for the better, while others are for the worst. The biggest complaint I had, personally, was the lack of inclusion on Uncle Ben's behalf. Because, in a sense, Parker's values were displaced by a desire for a father figure like Tony. Uncle Ben's death was the trial-by-error mistake Peter makes that not only affects everyone around him, including family members, but teaches him that when you use your powers irresponsibly, you suffer the consequences for yourself, as well as everyone around you. Ben's death literally inspired the entire motivation behind Parker's inspiration to be someone better than who he is. Whereas in Homecoming, he basically was a hero because he looked up to other heroes. He didn't learn about responsibilities through the most painstaking death in his entire life. Instead, he learns of responsibility just because his idol is also seen as a responsible figure and he wants to be him. Or hell, maybe he didn't even learn of responsibility in Homecoming. The third act gets a little confusing, quite honestly. And that really bothered me, because it had felt like they took the most complex aspect of Parker's entire character and displaced it with something much more muddied and confused. But then, Endgame happened. So, I know by this point there's a lot of hopping around years and they're skipping certain key events like Spider-Verse, which I will go into soon, but I want to highlight Endgame first because it's the movie that truly opened my eyes as to what story they were trying to tell with Homecoming and Far From Home. Homecoming never told the story of Ben Parker's death because they're intentionally not telling the traditional Peter Parker story. Rather, they're opting to go an entirely new direction altogether. One that couldn't be told in the Raimi films, and therefore is all its own. This is further backed up when you look at Spider-Verse, an amazing, breathtaking experience that, while it does have its own flaws, in particular rushed character development, is still an absolutely fantastic movie that once again doesn't tell the traditional tale of Peter Parker, but still has the heart that comes with the Spider-Man brand. Basically, what I'm saying is we live in a golden age of Spider-Man media, specifically because every new big screen iteration of the character actively avoids being the Tobey Maguire interpretation, but is still able to tell the story with just as much heart, passion, and care as the original trilogy. The MCU Spider-Man tells a story that no other version of the story could be told in. Peter Parker, absent of a father figure, looks up to his idol from a very young age, and when he's given the opportunity to work alongside said figure, he does everything he can to protect and impress that figure, much like how an actual father-son relationship functions. Likewise, Tony, a character we've seen develop for just about a decade by this point, always had daddy issues, so to speak. He never got that father-son time he desired and needed as a kid, and in doing so, fills the void with his amazing technology, to compensate, really. This is his entire arc from all three Iron Man films, him learning that sometimes the suit just isn't as important or special as he previously thought, and that Iron Man isn't what makes him great. Tony Stark is what makes him great. He goes from ignoring his insecurities and flaws because he's Iron Man to dealing with his insecurities and flaws as Iron Man. Yet, even still, when Parker finally walks in on his life, he doesn't realize that he's pretty much a father figure of his own, and in doing so, repeats his one-sided relationship that he held with his own father. That is, until Peter dies, of course. After which, Tony feels remarkable guilt on a daily basis, the scale of which is what sets him to go after the time travel hypothesis to see if it is a possibility. When Parker and Stark finally reunite, he tries to right his wrongs and embraces the bond they've shared together, indulging in his role as Peter's father figure. Which is what makes his death even more unnerving, because now Parker is absent of a father figure again, but he now has an enormous amount of responsibility to fill. It's basically like the MCU's very own take on Uncle Ben's death, but with characters and scenarios switched around a little bit. What makes it so interesting is just how this isn't a story that could be told in the Raimi lineup of films. That because it's set up on the backbone of an entire cinematic universe, it can indulge in its own world a little more, rather than attempt to recapture the love of the original trilogy, butchering the experience in the process like how Mark Webb approached it. Furthermore, Spider-Verse is interesting because it tells the story of about 6 different Spider-Men, all with the same general outline as the classic story, but with entirely different takes. Once again, while the main character of the story, Miles, does go through similar tribulations as both versions of Peter Parker in this film, these are not the same stories, instead opting for an experience that neither the Raimi films or the MCU films could tackle on their own. What makes this the golden age for me is how every take on Spider-Man and the characters within that universe are distinctly their own. Which means Spider-Man is capable of tackling all sorts of different stories with different issues, different outcomes, and different payoffs, making for some of the best moments of the character's history on the big screen. It also makes it easier for people to identify with Spider-Man on top of all of that. MCU tackled a version of Spider-Man that neither the Raimi films or the Spider-Verse could tackle. Spider-Verse took on a plot that couldn't be replicated by aforementioned MCU films or, once again, the Raimi films. And the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man takes on a perspective of the character that can't ever be replicated through any other retelling. So why even try? Especially whenever there's so much more you can do with the character, like what we're witnessing today. And besides, the Raimi films are timeless. They'll be respected and enjoyed for generations to come, so why not take that and make something new and creative with it? Fuck you, Mark Webb.